So the problem is these people are suffering and there's no one there to help them because nobody's in government.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Manestream Media podcast, hosted here at Raw News, King's College London's student newspaper. Today, we look at the situation in Northern Ireland. In part 1, we lay out the context of the Good Friday Agreement, Brexit, and where Northern Irish politics is today. In part 2, we include more Northern Irish voices to discuss attitudes towards sectarianism, religion, independence, and dairy girls today. I'm Fintan Hogan, comment editor here at Raw, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Manestream Media.
Fintan, let me avoid the question. Let me avoid the question.
Their best politician is a previous president.
I mean, half the Conservative Party forgot what Johnson did in like 6 weeks.
We know that doing nothing gets nothing done.
Your paleo-conservative prophet.
Is democracy under genuine threat in Brazil?
Fade away into neoliberal nothingness.
Frankly, there's a good chance that he's going to be kicked out of the House of Commons.
Way back on the gravy train. That's not going to happen.
They are actively trying to undermine the democratic decision that was made in 2020.
Welcome to this episode, and to start off we have two voices from either side of the Northern Irish border, more or less. I'd like you to introduce yourselves. First we have Connor.
Hi, I'm Connor. I am the other comment editor here at Roar, and I am from the Republic of Ireland.
Hi, I'm Electra. I'm a writer at Roar, and my mum's from Northern Ireland, but I'm from Switzerland.
Well, thank both of you for coming on today. We're trying to host more podcasts about the diversity of Kings, particularly the international diversity, and especially with our King's Vote series, issues of democracy and maybe where democracy is not doing so well. And this is what brought my attention to the Northern Irish issue. I have friends who are Northern Irish, and some of them brought to my attention more recent issues over the legislative state of the Assembly in the North. And I'd like you two at the start to explain some of the history and the context behind that. So if we could start by going way back to possibly our parents' generation, would you, one of you, mind giving me a rundown of what were the Troubles and why do our parents talk about them?
Yeah, sure. I mean...
Go for it, Connor.
Oh, God. Okay. I mean, the Troubles was a 30-year period in Northern Irish history, which, as is demonstrated in the name, was a period of violence between the two opposing sides, the Unionists and the Nationalists, and generally...
What did the Unionists want? What did the Nationalists want?
So Unionists would like to remain part of the United Kingdom, and their goal is to remain part of that union. The Nationalists obviously would prefer to be part of the Republic. They would hope that the whole of the island of Ireland would become a republic. And generally, when people talk about those two sides, Catholicism is associated with nationalism, and then Protestant is the religion that is associated with unionism. So the IRA was the Catholic nationalist side fighting in that battle, and then the UDA was the unionist side. And so it was a period of prolonged violence in the North that came to an end then with the Good Friday Agreement.
And in the United Kingdom.
Well, and in the Republic as well. We to a lesser extent in the Republic, but certainly, the violence did spill over into both jurisdictions.
So it ended up coming to a point where everybody kind of just wanted it to stop. So everyone came together and they crafted the Good Friday Agreement, which was signed in 1998. And
I should point out that I think in the UK it's generally referred to amongst the UK government as the Belfast Agreement as well. That's another term for it.
Definitely. And so it kind of created the devolved system of government that we have now, where it's on a power sharing basis. So half of government is, I guess, nationalist and the other half unionist.
Is this devolution more like the Welsh devolution or like the Scottish devolution? Is there a large amount of power given to the Assembly, or is it kind of a symbolic body?
I think that they have a fairly significant degree of power. I mean, Northern Ireland has its own legal jurisdiction, coming from a legal background. It has its own legal jurisdiction. So I think that the amount of devolution of power was relatively substantial in that regard. So yeah, I would think that they have a fairly significant amount of power.
It is, well, both parts like vote and take part in all of the legislation, and it's just whoever has the majority has the Prime Minister, so, well, not the Prime Minister,
The First Minister.
Yeah, First Minister. So for example, beforehand, it used to be Jeffrey Donaldson. No, it wasn't.
Paul Given was the...
Paul Given,
yes,
and then
he
now he's gone bye-byes. It's supposed to be, nowadays, supposed to be Michelle O'Neill, because Sinn Féin won, so the National...
So could you...
it's a complex arrangement that I think is quite difficult to understand unless you sort of, are part of that body, but effectively it's supposed to represent the population. So in terms of Northern Ireland, there's obviously a large Catholic population. There's a large nationalist population, a large unionist population, and then there's sort of some who wouldn't identify as either. And so as part of the agreement, each MLA, which is the equivalent of an MP, and each party has to align themselves one way or the other. So effectively what you then see is that the power sharing effectively means that the number of positions given to ministers is divided up evenly amongst the proportion of the vote that each sort of nationalist section or each unionist section received. So that's how it works.
Is there an independent section as well?
So technically, yes, you can have an independent section. I don't know, do the Alliance technically... No, they don't align themselves as independent, sorry, but there is another section.
So the Good Friday Agreement was successful in bringing to an end this period of conflict and establishing a devolved assembly in Northern Ireland, which is generally seen power shared between the two sides.
Yeah,
correct?
I think the point was that both sides were being heard, so there wasn't a need to fight over control.
Yeah, and so the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister had to be from the largest nationalist and the largest unionist parties. So there was a sort of coming together of the two sides was the idea behind it.
Perfect. So the Good Friday Agreement was agreed in what year?
1998.
Perfect. And
on Good Friday.
On Good Friday, 1998. And how well did it work at first? Speaking maybe for the early 2000s, was it generally successful? Moderately?
Yeah, I mean, it
But there's no more conflict, I suppose.
Yeah, so I mean, okay, so the agreement put an end to the immediate violence. And it certainly did bring about a system of government. Whether that system has held up and worked effectively is a different question. As we're seeing now, there's no government, and there have been a number of periods where there has been no government at Stormont as a result of the technical and complex process by which both sides have to come together and agree, and that's very difficult when they've been fighting for so many years. But in a very immediate sense, it definitely brought an end to the violence and conflict that we had seen at the time and the number of killings that we were seeing. So from that perspective, it has certainly worked wonders.
Since the Brexit referendum in 2016, the United Kingdom government has agreed what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol with the European Union. Could either of you please briefly explain what that is and maybe any challenges that brought for governance in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so basically the main problem with the Northern Irish Protocol is because Britain is leaving the EU, there has to be a check between Britain and the EU when it comes to goods. The problem is, on the island of Ireland, you've got Northern Ireland and the Republic, and there is a border there, but not one that you can see, and that was the point also of the agreement, was not having a limit there, because it was a big point of contention during the Troubles. The problem with the NI Protocol, well, forming a border for trade between Britain and the EU, is that you do need to have a border somewhere, and a big part of Brexit negotiations were just everybody agreed that you could not put a border between the north and the south. There was no way that was going to go over well. So what they've done now is formed the NI Protocol, which in theory would mean that the trade border would be between Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain. So, like in the
Irish
water.
Sea.
Yeah. So this border in the Irish Sea was something that some groups were opposed to. Why is that?
Well, basically, it would mean that when people trade, Northern Ireland trade-wise is under EU jurisdiction, and so they have to follow EU rules, and then the rest of Britain follow British rules. And the problem also is that it basically draws a line between Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain, which the DUP, who are unionists, really don't like, because it feels like they're not part of Britain anymore. Some might argue that it's not really that important, as also mostly the problem is that I guess that Northern Ireland benefits more from this situation than Britain does. It's better for them economically speaking, trade-wise.
Yeah, so quite simplistically, the unionists wanted the border on one side and the nationalists wanted the border on the other side, because association with one of these two blocks was more
yeah, so wherever you put the border effectively is where you're drawing the line between, from the DUP's perspective, where the border is currently drawn in the Unionist aligned party, where the border is currently drawn in the Irish Sea means that they are not a full member of the United Kingdom, because the goods need to be checked before they come into Northern Ireland's jurisdiction, and they would perceive this as being, not in conformity with them being a full member of the United Kingdom. From the perspective of the Republic, the one thing that the EU certainly had guaranteed all the way through the negotiations was that there was not going to be any hard border between the Northern Ireland and the Republic, and that was something that was very important to the Republic for our trade, from the Republic's trading perspective, and also because the foundation of the protocol, or the Good Friday Agreement, was to keep peace, and it was felt that by putting a border up between Northern Ireland and Ireland, that peace would be very much at risk once again. So the EU strongly I suppose wanted to make sure that this border did not lie on the Northern Ireland border, and so it was thought that the best option was to put it in the sea.
It was more or less the red line for the EU, more or less, was any sort of border on the island.
Yeah, and that's something that they really focused on, and I suppose from an Irish perspective, that was something that we in the Republic were very grateful for, because there was, I suppose, a period after the vote where there was a question as to where this border could conceivably lie, and if it was to lie between Northern Ireland and Ireland, that would have had quite significant repercussions for Irish business, and also probably for the peace agreement.
And so what's the state of Stormont today?
Basically what's happened is the DUP, the Unionist Party, who are upset that there's been a line drawn essentially between the North and Britain, have decided that they're not going to turn up to government as a sign of protest. If Britain and the EU don't fix the Northern Irish Protocol, and that they find is flawed in their eyes, they won't turn up to government. So in May of this year, we had an election and to decide who would have majority in government. And Sinn Féin, a nationalist party, won. And following that election, the DUP, who were a unionist party, who had always had majority, then announced that they wouldn't come into Parliament to work. And the issue with that is that because of the Good Friday Agreement and devolved government and power sharing, you can't actually have government if both parties don't turn up. So essentially, nothing's been happening in government because the DUP won't turn up.
Yeah, so in that election, it was the first time ever that Sinn Féin has had a majority.
So every previous First Minister had been from the DUP, or from a Unionist party. And so Sinn Féin returned 27 MLAs and the DUP returned 25, so they have a two MLA majority. But the DUP then have used the Northern Ireland Protocol issue as their kind of reason not to participate in government currently. Now, there's questions as to whether that's a legitimate reason or not, but ultimately the problem is that because they are not willing to take part in government, Stormont can't function due to the Good Friday Agreement requiring the cooperation of both sides. And this is where you really see, I suppose, the breakdown of the agreement and where the struggles are in terms of actually
in terms of this agreement functioning properly.
So what conditions would need to be met for the DUP to say that they'd go back into government?
They've said like destruction of the Northern Irish Protocol. Well, destruction's a strong word, but taking it down essentially.
Yeah, and so, well, there's currently a bill passing through Parliament here in Westminster, which is the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, and the proposal is that rather than all goods being checked on the way into Northern Ireland, they would have two channels: a green channel, which I believe is for goods that are going to stay in Northern Ireland, or is it the other way around? The red one is for goods staying in Northern Ireland.
It's what I heard was the green channel was pre-approved goods, so like with people that they know that they've like traders that they've agreed to.
So one channel is effectively for goods that aren't going to travel further into the EU, and that would be fine. And the other one is for goods that we know are going to travel further into the EU. Those would have to be checked. At present, all goods going over to Northern Ireland have to be checked. And so the proposal is to have the two channels. They also propose that Northern Ireland would be under the tax remit of Westminster again, rather than currently they have to conform to the EU's tax rules around goods because of the current situation, and also that they wouldn't be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice when it comes to issues around those goods. There have been suggestions, certainly from a Republic of Ireland perspective and the EU perspective, that this is in contravention of international law. The EU has actually initiated legal action on this front, and the contention is that the UK signed up to the protocol. They agreed to it at the time, and they cannot now unilaterally decide that they can't unilaterally decide that they're going to do their own thing, which the EU would have no input in. So that is the current situation.
For Stormont to sit, as you've said, it doesn't seem like there's a very easy solution to get the DUP quickly back into government. Is there any viable solutions on the horizon which don't involve the entire renegotiation of the border settlement?
Right now, all they've said is the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris, has said that he's going to change some legislation to give the people who have basically taken over for ministers more power, because the problem right now is they can't really do anything that hasn't been pre-approved by
essentially
ministers.
The civil service running government.
Yeah, exactly.
But only
they can
directives of political decisions which have been made before Stormont stops.
Yes, they can only take decisions which are deemed sort of uncontroversial. So so the likes of setting out a budget, which is due to be decided in the near future in the north, is deemed a very controversial decision. So that can't be done, and that leads to obviously big problems with public finances. So the proposal is to extend further power to these civil servants, and also the Northern Ireland Secretary is under a legal obligation to call an election. Now, there's another proposal, because of the fact that there's no government currently, there's another proposal to extend the length of time which he would be allowed before calling that election. So that legislation would have to work its way through Westminster before that is allowed. But I think that seems to be something that is definitely on the horizon. And Mr. Heaton-Harris has suggested, I think, that either March or April next year would be the time at which a new election would be called.
So it doesn't seem like there's going to be any election. There were talk of elections this winter, but they've been pushed back at least till after Christmas.
The thing is, like...
He's conclusively said definitely not prior to Christmas, which means that they definitely have to get this legislation through, because they would have to call it before Christmas otherwise.
We're going to get some more partisan voices on after the break to discuss some of the social issues there, and maybe if there's any alternative, any way out of this other than the fudge of extending the civil services power and just waiting to hold elections as long as possible. So thank you too for giving us the background, and we look forward to having both of you back for us with the second section coming up soon. Welcome back. Now we have two Northern Irish KCL students here with us. Would you mind introducing yourselves?
Hello, I'm Joshua. I'm from around the County Armagh area, more specifically Craigavon, and I'm a unionist.
My name is Alina Joseph. I am from Bangor in County Down. But I was born in India and then grew up in Northern Ireland, and I am of the nationalist perspective.
Perfect, thank you. It's good to get some diversity of opinion on here, so thank both of you for coming on. We've heard from Electra and colleges before what a mess the Stormont Assembly is in at the moment. Well, what's the way out of this? Either of you. We'll talk about specific issues later, but overall, is the constitutional architecture correct? Is there any way out of this?
It's a bit of a deep question. There's there's a very broad. There's a very broad scope there. So in the Good Friday Agreement, you've got all the strands. You've got different things, and essentially, because I remember in my history course back in school in Northern Ireland, we were taught about the Good Friday Agreement. We had people in class who were they insisted on calling it the Belfast Agreement because you dare not put the name, you dare not put good in the name of the Good Friday Agreement, which was so awful. I don't think it was terribly awful. I think it was a pretty good thing. Very good thing, actually, for that matter. But sort of in the Good Friday Agreement, there was a lot of stuff which I remember my history teacher expressing that it was fudged over. And is that, we sort of put some issues off, legacy issues that keep coming up.
Fudge was exactly the term I wanted to use earlier with how the civil service are now basically running the government. I think that's exactly right.
I think you can definitely feel a sense of urgency in it, as in, how many years of bloodshed and violence?
It was 30 from 69 to 99. Really.
I think at that point everyone just wanted the violence to be over. People were ready for
I feel like people were ready almost immediately, though. That's the thing. That's
after over 20 years, is this fudge still sustainable, or has it gone off?
I think the obvious answer is no.
We still, it still comes up in Stormont quite a lot in the Legislative Assembly about different legacy issues. I know that there are always legacy issues, like, do we give particular benefits and things to those who are victims of the Troubles, those who have been really desperately affected, because then once you start to delve down that rabbit hole, you've got, these people, they were effectuating that violence, so, do we want to set the sort of example that we give money to people who are violent in society and led to the perpetuation of, that issue that has defined our entire country? And
what's the perception towards specifically just Stormont, though? What's the perception towards that nowadays?
I think, not many people have any sort of faith in Stormont.
Oh, no.
I
was about to say, I was about to pipe on being like, oh, goodness, Stormont.
No, it's just, no one has any faith in any of the devolved government at all.
It's just such a difficult issue because we want, I think it's pretty safe to say that collectively we want a devolved government to represent our views, because it's so, it's very personal. It's very personal, it's very unique, and it's so difficult to encompass if you haven't grown up experiencing it, so it very much has to be, it's very much, there's a lot of political cleavage, and, it has to be very much from the Northern Irish people to make any sort of change.
Yeah, no, I completely
agree.
But
is the idea of united government still sustainable if one party is refusing to sit as soon as it loses an election?
Well, that is the issue. That is the issue where, that's part of the reason why the Good Friday Agreement sort of, I don't want to say fails, because that would be a
fails
very
is a strong word, but
controversial statement. But it's the fact that, it's just, there's no accountability for it at all. The whole government relies on cooperation, and if one party decides that it doesn't like the situation, then everyone else feels the...
It's an extreme case of the old trope against proportional representation in political theory, is that you have the trade-off between accountability and representation. So we've got really good representation. I think that's very much the case, and that's why the Good Friday Agreement was, you had people like Bill Clinton even came over and endorsed it and signed. I think he signed it, but I know didn't he give a speech?
Yeah, he liked it. He liked it a lot.
Yeah.
If you watch Dairy Girls,
you'll
know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Oh, Bill. But
Dairy Girls later.
Yeah, so we've got really good representation, but not so much accountability, as can be clearly seen in the media at the moment. It's like, how can one party, especially one party that is, the majority party of, I guess, my side of the aisle, how can they just, I can see how they can, because they don't agree with what's going on. They think it's very much a symbolic issue of the border in the sea is pushing us away from the United Kingdom.
Coming to this idea of accountability, obviously the one party you're referring to is the Democratic Unionist Party, which is the one that is refusing to sit in Stormont now. They were also part of the Supply and Confidence Agreement, which propped up Theresa May's government before. How do people perceive the DUP on both sides, before and after both the Supply and Confidence Agreement and not joining Stormont, over the implications of Brexit that we have discussed with our previous people? Are people fed up with the DUP, or are partisans going to be partisans?
The people who support the DUP support the DUP.
Oh, that's big time. That's
Big time.
deep rooted.
It's, but people who don't, I think, are very sick of them. Yeah. On both sides, because...
I mean, it's, 65-70% of the country don't support or didn't vote for the DUP, so it's, when there's one group holding the whole thing up.
It's awful, because it's not just this issue that they've held up, like, it took Northern Ireland so many years to even get things like same-sex marriage legalised, or on the issue of abortion, the DUP has been very, very unhelpful. Even after Northern Ireland was sort of forced to legalise abortion, the DUP refused to give any funding or any sort of supply for that. So while in theory that Northern Ireland does have abortion laws, in practicality it's not available to Northern Irish.
If there was an election tomorrow, you don't have the polling, but would you expect the DUP to perform worse or better than they did last time after this intransigence?
The same.
Exactly the same?
Yeah.
So I actually wrote in my personal statement about this whole politics aspect. My personal statement was based on the tribal lines voting phenomena that is so prevalent in Northern Ireland, like in the electoral system of Northern Ireland. It's like it's more about keeping the other side out than getting your representatives in.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got very perfectly represented government, sort of in proportion. But, I mean, is it really representative if you're not voting for representation?
Yeah. It's very much you vote on a line of your identity and of your culture more than... I can imagine that most people who do vote probably don't even know the party's manifesto or their alignments or their agreements. They vote because they are the Unionist Party, or they vote because they are the Nationalist Party.
So these sectarian attitudes, as we referenced before, things of the Derry Girls have been our best cultural reference point, at least for us, and many of us in the UK. Our best cultural reference point for Northern Ireland is Derry Girls, the ideas of things like the Orange Order and these kind of tropes. So you seem to be saying that these kind of sectarian attitudes on both sides seem to still be existing. There's no sign of them waning.
It's still very much in recent memory. Like, I don't think it'll disappear anytime soon. Like, people definitely, like, I think...
In our generation, at those aged between 15 and 25?
There's definitely a change. I mean, there's more of a Northern Irish identity now rather
that is very true.
Rather than a British or Irish. Like, when you're asked who you are, I mean, I said that I'm Northern Irish, then I say I'm British, but...
I mean, the thing is, at the end of the day, I think, is one thing that should be noted is the fact that our schools are segregated. Like, it's crazy, but we have separate, like...
by religion?
Yeah, by religion. So...
You do get Catholic schools. I
went to a Catholic school.
And I went to a school with a Protestant Christian ethos.
There you go.
A Protestant school.
Yeah.
A Protestant school. And when you're 11, you can do... like the tests or exams to go into a grammar school. Mm-hmm. There's one for Catholic schools and the's one for every other grammar school. Yes, so two separate tests, but Catholic schools have a separate one. So I did both.
It's largely self-selecting as to, like, Catholics choose to do the Catholic test and stay there, so you'd never choose to do the test.
I think you do choose your school. I mean, you've got the streaming area around the school, like within so many miles, then you're eligible for transport to school and stuff like that, just a normal education system. But I definitely think it is self-perpetuating in the choice of parents to send their kids to like-minded schools.
I mean, primary schools as well, like there are because I went to a Catholic primary school as well, I remember because Bangor's very, very unionist. It was like the only Catholic school in the town or whatever. Right beside us was a non-denominational school, and there was a lot of I remember we did like a cross community.
We did loads of cross.
So
many
stuff. Cross community things.
I remember learning the tin whistle.
Wow.
No way.
Yeah, I remember learning the tin whistle with another school.
Wow, just in order to try and break down borders, or how do they phrase it?
It's just sort of like you have, I don't know, how do
it was really interesting for us, right? So it was our school, then another school who were obviously a Catholic school. Then we met in a disabled school to learn how to play the tin whistle. It was an interesting arrangement.
Do these things work to any extent
I don't know
educate
about
young people?
But to be fair, I was like 7, so I didn't actually know why we were doing this. I was just like, we're playing dodgeball instead of doing work. That's
all you want.
Okay, maybe for slightly older age groups, maybe if they're 12 to 15, and then is this kind of education
most reasonable people are just like, they're just another person with a different opinion.
Exactly.
It's like there's no real.
But these voting blocks are still so ingrained.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see how that continues into the future because, again, as I said, like, even my parents, 40, 50, 60, that age group, they're still going to be here and voting for
very true as well.
Like another couple decades.
That's true.
So it is like I don't think we're going to see any substantive change for at least another 50 years.
I would agree with that.
Like at least.
Wow, interesting. I'd like to bring back in our two previous contributors here to talk a bit more about the crisis, fair to say, of the moment. Stormont's not been sitting properly since the elections held in May, I think, this year. And there is now a huge crisis of the cost of living, as we're all experiencing, and as well of government overspend. I think Electra has a kind of summary of that sort of fiscal black hole, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, well, the problem is if no one's in government, they can't help people out. So a lot of people this winter are having issues. They don't think they're actually going to have heating or electricity. And there isn't actually there's a proposed payment of £400, I think it is, for energy payments to households to help them get by, but that's actually been delayed because nobody's in government to be able to help get those payments through. So the problem is these people are suffering and there's no one there to help them because nobody's in government. And I think maybe that's why I feel like there could be a change in DUP support, because maybe if you feel like your government isn't there for you, there might be a change in opinion. But
interesting. So there's a huge black hole in government finances. Is that fair?
Aye, but like
nothing new. Was it nothing new? So between January 2017 and January 2020, we had no government either. But it wasn't even just until January 2020 they came back. They said hello and then went away again for another year. It was over 1,000 days with no government.
We're so used to this. It's just like I think that's why no one actually looks at it as like a political.
You don't take it seriously
mechanism.
when it behaves like this.
But it is. Serious.
No one respects it.
But it is serious because
there's a
it's desperately serious.
Yeah.
Like my school, we ran out of money. Like no, we didn't run out of money. We couldn't afford to print our notes. Like the school, the note, like the wee booklets I gave you, couldn't afford to print that because the Ministry for Education couldn't give the money to the Education Authority, who couldn't give the money to schools. So all the schools in my local area were like 100 grand in debt because of that 3-year period.
Wow. I'd like to bring our Republic of Ireland person in there. So do the people and do the government of the Republic of Ireland want, if there was a mandate for it in whatever way, would they want this kind of systematic problem added on?
As in, if the North was to rejoin with the Republic?
If the North, yes.
Set
aside all the problems that might come
so the systematic problem
of Northern Ireland.
Well, that's an interesting question because I suppose so from a principle perspective, the Republic certainly wants to reunite with the North. There's no question about that. I think that, if there was to be a border poll as outlined in the Good Friday Agreement, the Republic wouldn't pose a problem.
How is it outlined? Just to give us
some it's under the remit of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. If the Secretary of State is of the perception that there is a nationalist majority in the North, then they are obliged to have a border poll to propose reunification, and so there would have to be agreement both on the northern end and on the Republic end. I think the Republic would pose no issue.
Even with all these problems and the debt?
So we obviously there is that question of the debt, but I think that in the Republic there is very much a perception that it's part of the island of Ireland, and so it would be ludicrous. For some people, they feel it would be ludicrous to say, if we were given this opportunity to reunite, that we would say no. There is that debate about the economy, there's a lot of questions about how reunification would actually work practically. There's a lot of questions on that front, but from a purely sort of principle perspective, I think that the Republic would be very, very content to take back the North.
Very interesting. And this idea of a border poll referendum is triggered if the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland thinks that there is a nationalist majority. Is there?
Well, there is. We won an election. Like.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting
we
thing,
being
though.
the nationalists.
Oh yeah,
The
sorry.
nationalists, the nationalists have won. But I think that in and of itself, the census, it doesn't actually convey like the actual. And that's the issue with Northern Ireland, because then you're sort of reduced to you're either a nationalist or a unionist, you're either Catholic or Protestant. And that's always been the issue with Northern Ireland. I feel like that doesn't convey the actual sort of spectrum of political ideologies and political views that people do have. Because I would know a lot of people who would identify themselves as Irish, who have born and brought up in Northern Ireland, identify themselves as Irish, but they would prefer to stay in the Union if that's what... if that's how, because if they have a job in the NHS, if that's how,
Big time.
Yeah, right.
I was thinking of that.
There's I know a lot of like I don't know how to, like politically, nationalist, economically unionist people. I do know a lot of people like that.
Yeah, because technically it's really hard, especially with questions of the NHS.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, about the NHS. Is that
oh
like
right. Well, I mean, a lot of people in Northern Ireland are employed by the NHS. That's for sure. I mean, everyone has. You've got multiple nurses per family. Like 100%.
Why is that so high?
I don't know.
Don't know. Just want to be
is.
nurses.
I think that if you look at it objectively, from the perspective of whether determining the nationalist unionist side of things, the recent election is obviously a good indicator of that.
Yeah.
You would suggest maybe that when a nationalist party gains a majority, there is probably a nationalist majority within the country.
Right.
Another indicator is the census, because that demonstrated that there was a Catholic majority, and generally we would associate Catholics with falling along nationalist lines. However, I think the problem at the moment is that that majority is so slim.
Yeah.
And that because it's so slim, it would be very divisive if you were to call that poll now. And also you'd have to wait under the agreement, you have to wait a further 7 years before you can have another poll. And so I think that because it's so slim,
strategically
there's
it's maybe
no
not the
certainty
best
around
idea if that's your objective.
And it's also been an issue that has become more prevalent recently, and I think the view would be that the longer you give this, the more definitive things will be. So we'll know more about if the North was to reunite, what practically would have to happen, and that would give people more certainty to vote along a nationalist line or to vote along a unionist line.
So the census that Connor and others referred to was a census conducted within the last year, which showed a majority of Northern Irish now identify as Catholic rather than previously that's been Protestant. So obviously the question is, if people fall along the traditional religious line of who would vote to leave the United Kingdom, does that mean that people politically would also vote along that? Do you think that maybe Sinn Féin and others have learnt from the mistake of that the SNP made when they called the referendum, or they pushed for the referendum in 2014? They pushed too soon. Do you think they're going to bide their time? And is it a question of not if but when?
I think it's definitely a question of not if but when.
Definitely.
In all times.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah.
Definitely.
Probably the next decade.
Yeah,
I can see one in the next decade. Yeah.
I know Sinn Féin said border poll in 2-3 years, but I think they're just
I think
they're saying that just to get people
get
people in the mood for it.
Yeah.
And
but people have been
certainly
saying
in the south. In the south, there's or in the Republic, there's the perception that there will be a poll, but not for a few years. So there's the sort of the political parties in the Republic have been eyeing up maybe a 5 or 6 year kind of timeline in terms of having that poll. So
before 2030, all of you think there'll be a poll?
Yeah.
Well, I do think the situation with Brexit and the protocol is definitely going to influence what happens with a border poll. Because if people are really unhappy with the way it's been handled, there's probably going to be some thought about what the British government is doing for Northern Ireland and if it's worth actually staying.
So has Brexit sped up the...
Oh, definitely.
I feel like that plays,
on the table.
Does that not play just right into the DUP's hands, though, in saying that, that section off and get away with Northern Ireland, and then the unionist community might just be like, oh, right, well, we see that.
Yeah.
The DUP were right.
Definitely. As soon as you start talking about a border, you start talking about, questions of a border poll. And I think, the unionists do have a point when they say that there is a line between, Northern Ireland and Britain.
It's
with
slightly
the-
more than symbolic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a valid argument.
Yeah, of course.
But the issue of a border poll did come up as soon as Brexit became an issue. I don't
put
think
it back
this
on the table.
surprises anyone.
Well, it's like with Scotland. Like as soon as Brexit happened, they were like, "Wait, no, we want to re-vote again. We do want to leave." So I think, especially because Northern Ireland didn't actually vote for Brexit.
Exactly.
We wanted to remain. So I think, especially now, like it really.
Even though we were quite divisively remain, it was quite a slim majority also. I think it was 54-46.
Yeah.
Everything's a slim majority.
Yeah,
in
that's
Northern
the
Ireland.
thing.
Yeah, no, Clem, what would there be a majority for? What would most Northern Irish people want changed today?
Have a functioning government, maybe?
Yeah, have a government that
actually does
shows up.
things.
I think cutting MLA's salaries, I think there would be a
I
decisive
agree.
majority on that.
I agree with that.
Everyone
They're
wants to
already
cut
doing
their
that.
Yeah,
salaries.
they are.
They're doing
They're
that
cutting
at the
it.
moment.
Yeah.
I know, but cut it to zero.
Are they still,
Yeah.
are they
If
still
they're not
being
there.
paid while they're not attending?
Yeah.
They get
They had a
50
3-year
something-
holiday.
They get 50
Yeah.
something £1,000 a year. Yeah.
Yeah.
And similarly, so the DUP aren't attending Stormont now, but historically and symbolically, Sinn Féin, when they're elected in parliamentary elections, don't attend Westminster,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which changes some of the voting calculus. You might see there's sometimes strange numbers for majorities because basically it's a moot point that the Sinn Féin just don't turn up. How has that changed their popularity? Like, how is that seen? Is that still supported amongst these groups?
I think, well, from what I can see from the younger perspective is that people find that really stupid.
Yeah.
People are just like, I mean,
Don't
especially
waste representation.
Exactly,
Like,
exactly.
that's the golden rule here.
We've seen 3 years of inactivity.
Yeah.
Like, we know that doing nothing gets nothing done. Like, yes, there's the whole symbolic aspect of like, oh, we dislike Parliament. We don't like the Queen, or sorry, the King now. We're not gonna sit in Parliament. Okay, well, now we have no nationalist voice in Parliament. Like for ages, God, I can't remember her name, but the MP for North Down, who was an independent. She was a UUP member, but then became
Which is
an
another
independent.
unionist party.
Hmm?
Which is another unionist.
Yeah, the
Yes,
Ulster
yes, yes.
Unionist
Ulster
Party.
Unionist.
Ulster Unionist, and then she ran as an independent. She was the only nationalist voice in Parliament for a long time because Sinn Féin just did not take their seats.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's not ridiculous, then I don't know what
Yeah,
is.
Well, there is something to be said about the fact that Sinn Féin did like not turn up to government for a while in 2017.
I was going to say that that's something that... So I know we've acknowledged the DUP currently are posing the problem, but Sinn Féin have been the cause of such a problem back in 2017 during the, I believe it was termed the Cash for Ash scandal, if I'm not mistaken. The DUP and Arlene Foster were engaged in some kind of scandal, energy scandal
Yeah,
at
it
the
was
time.
Renewable Heat Initiative.
Would one of you please explain that?
So essentially, the DUP offered this scheme about like get a wood chip boiler for your house, and there's cost savings. The government pays you back so much, but it turned out that it was a massive loss-making scheme, and it was a really bad idea, and it blew up into this whole, inflamed scandal.
Mm-hmm. And that led to
But importantly,
not
Sinn
sitting.
Féin decided that they then were going to do exactly what the DUP have currently done, which is, this one
not sure.
issue was what they decided they
It's
weren't
not a
going
unique
to
strategy.
show up to Stormont for. And so, we've seen both sides engaging in this kind of activity. Just currently, it's the DUP that are doing it, which...
It seems that both main parties seem to go for inactivity when they're faced with this sort of issue, but then what you've said is that the one thing that Northern Ireland might have a majority is some sort of activity, some sort of government. It seems strange that the thing that you've said would be most popular is the thing that neither of the main parties are doing. Could there be like a groundswell in Northern Irish politics where people decide maybe let's move to the middle, or is that like we come back to the point before?
There is a bit of a move to the middle at the moment. Alliance are picking up a bit of traction.
Who are the alliances?
So the alliance body, if you think about it like a horseshoe, you've got Sinn Féin and DUP at the two prongs. Then right at the bottom, like sort of equidistant from the prongs, you've got the Alliance Party. Then just moving slightly up towards the prongs again, you've got the SDLP for the nationalist side and the UUP, the Ulster Unionists, for the unionist side. So that's sort of in terms of moderation.
Yes.
You get more extreme as you go up.
Yeah.
I think Alliance got 17 MLAs in the last election, so that's a very high proportion when you think that Sinn Féin got 27, DUP got 25. 17 is not insignificant at all.
Is an alliance and then the two more moderate parties government possible Would that be on the cards at some point in the future?
Would be nice.
It would be nice, but what you have seen is people aren't voting for the moderate parties. They're either
No.
voting in the middle or to
There's
the
been a real
extremes.
downward trend for the moderate parties, at least with the Ulster Unionist Party.
Yeah, and with SDLP.
And with SDLP.
More people are voting
Which
for
is
them.
quite interesting because like some of the the great figures that championed and spearheaded the
Yeah.
Good Friday Agreement, like John Hume, for
Yeah.
example,
All SDLP.
they were SDLP, they were UUP.
But those parties have since lost so much popularity. Before we finish, not going on for much longer now, if there was a poll in 2 years or in 3 years a border poll that saw people of Northern Ireland and people of the Republic decide to reunite the island of Ireland, would violence restart?
It wouldn't be
Not
surprising.
unlikely.
Yeah.
Like when you go to the airport, it still says threat level severe.
Yeah.
Well, it's like I think last year they burned buses or something.
Oh, yeah.
In
Because
Bangor?
of it was
Yeah.
an IRA member's funeral that they weren't allowed to go to.
Yes, during
and it,
COVID.
through like loads, it started loads of problems up again. So I think like right now we're at peace, but you know.
It only
it's
takes
always-
one little
yeah.
thing for some kid to throw like
Yeah,
a Molotov.
It's
I think
always under the surface.
It's under the surface. That's a good way of terming it.
Isn't
But
it though?
the Good Friday Agreement got rid of the very international element of like everyone knows that this violence is happening. It was a big thing. Now I think we've seen little elements of violence every once in a while that still echo that former period of the Troubles, but aren't on that same level. And I think that the problem is that you can't say that the violence is fully gone, and so I think the fear is that if you change the situation, does that inflame what is still
It's
there?
still smouldering, I suppose.
I mean,
Yes.
the paramilitary
Are you
still
throwing fuel on the
exists.
fire?
Yeah.
I mean, have you? I don't know. If
I
you've seen
feel
the-
I feel like the paramilitaries are now much more based on private enterprise. Like for example, there's sort of this idea of one imports drugs and the other doesn't like drugs. So they're still battling each other at some
It's
point.
just
That's
not-
at least that's common public conception of what
Public opinion, yeah.
what it's still happening. But like for example,
sorry, you've all said that you think that in the next 10 years it's quite likely to be a border poll. Can we expect within the next 15 years that Northern Irish violence will be back at the top of our news headers?
it's hard to say. You can't give a definitive, but I mean it could.
It could.
I think
Very
the longer you
viable.
put it off, the border poll, the less likely it becomes.
Yeah, I think
Because
so.
I think that the younger people have less of, as we were saying earlier, an affiliation with either side. Some people would say that they feel Northern Irish. And so I think that makes it less likely that this kind of violence will become a thing again.
And
the
maybe the
you put
longer
it
they
off.
wait, the bigger the majority will be.
And that's true. And I think the problem currently is that it's just so slim that, one side will feel very aggrieved.
Yeah. So Connor's prescription for the problem is even more fudge. Okay. Finally, apart from the downbeat note that we hit at the end, I'd like the two of you, and maybe a lecturer as well, if you'd like. You've described Northern Irish identity as something new, resurgent, and something unique. What do you love about being Northern Irish, and what sets the two of you, or the three of you, apart from being just Irish or being just British?
Game of Thrones.
We've got Game of Thrones.
Yeah. We've got
What
the
else
Dark
do we have?
Edges, we've got the Giant's Causeway, we've got Ballintoy Harbour, we've got Port Ballantrae.
Well, I
Other
don't
than
know.
places, what makes a Northern Irish person?
I think.
Crisps.
Do you know what it is though? One thing I do miss when I'm in London and not home is that everyone, despite all this talk of violence and all, everyone's really friendly. Like,
Everyone is very
there
friendly.
is such a sense of community,
Even
no matter
across-
where you go.
Yeah.
Well, if they don't know,
No, it is quite funny when you meet another Northern Irish person. Be like, "Where are you from? Oh, where'd you go to school?" It's like you
who
start
do you
working
know?
down the list. Who do you know?
Say-
Well,
say
first
your
off,
alphabet.
you can work H.
H.
You don't need to do the other letters. Just H or H.
Is that that's the big dividing line?
Historically, they're just
Yeah.
like
Really?
little pernickety things. Yeah,
Okay.
that would give it away.
Electra, anything that you enjoy about your Northern Irish heritage?
I mean, I like the sense of community, like you were saying. Like every time I go back, it's just everybody's always like really nice to me, and they're always like asking about me. And I think that's not something in London or anywhere else I've really found. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for a pretty constructive discussion, and hope to see you again next time.
Thank you for the
Thank
opportunity.
you very much.
You're welcome.